As I'm recording this, I'm the pastor of St. Joseph the Worker Parish. It's the year of St. Joseph, and the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker is just a couple days away. So given all that, I figured I better make a video. So even though there's obviously been a great devotion to St. Joseph over the years, in 1955, Pope Pius XII officially established the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker, thereby highlighting St. Joseph not simply as the husband of Mary and the patron saint of the Church, but also the value and dignity of human labor, as embodied by the figure of St. Joseph the Worker. Now, in the face of it, this notion of the dignity of human labor might seem kind of obvious and straightforward, but it actually has really important implications in terms of our own life of discipleship. So the first thing that comes to mind is this idea that the dignity of human labor reminds us that we're called to live lives of integrity, which is basically to say this: the life of discipleship is not meant to be restricted only to Sundays, but instead it is meant to permeate every aspect of our lives, including our various relationships and friendships, our rest, our play, and certainly our work, the type of work that we do and the manner in which we actually do that work. So the example that always comes to mind when it comes to this sort of thing is the naming of the animals by the figure of Adam in the book of Genesis. And when it comes to the story, timing is really important. So you'll notice that God gives Adam the task of naming the different animals before the fall. So before the advent of original sin, again, Adam is given the particular task of naming the animals, which is really significant because it speaks to the fact that work in God's original plan was never meant to be this oppressive burden. It only became so in the aftermath of original sin. But again, in God's original plan, it was never meant to be the case. Instead, work was always meant to be this very precious opportunity whereby we are actually called to participate in the work of the Creator God, to collaborate in His providential designs in a very small but very significant sort of way. But again, more to the point, it speaks to the fact that we're called to live lives of integrity, to realize again that the life of discipleship is not meant to be restricted to our private prayer or weekend mass attendance, but instead is meant to permeate every aspect of our lives, including and especially in a certain sense, the way in which we do our work. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. But the second thing is this, and it's kind of related. This idea that the way in which we do our work can actually bring about the work of salvation. And so the example that always comes to mind in this regard is the hidden life of Jesus Christ himself. So as you probably know, before his death on the cross on Good Friday, Jesus Christ walked the face of the earth for about 33 years. 3 of those years, of course, were focused on public ministry, doing things like teaching, preaching, and working miracles, while the remainder of those years were focused on the hidden life, doing things like making tables and chairs in the nothing town of Nazareth in imitation of his foster father, St. Joseph the Worker. And even though in the face of those hidden years might seem to have been a total waste of Jesus' time, given the fact that, again, he could teach and preach and work all sorts of miracles, the fact that he spent so much time, again, in relative obscurity, doing such things as making tables and chairs, brings real attention to the fact that our ordinary labor has real value in God's providential designs. But it requires us to look at our ordinary labor from the perspective of faith as opposed to a more kind of worldly perspective. And so the example that comes to mind, and I think the story comes from the Middle Ages, but basically the story goes like this. There was this priest who was walking through this construction yard, I believe, and he saw these guys kind of moving stones from one place to the next. And he basically asked them what they were doing. And so the first guy basically said, well, I'm just doing what you see, right? I'm moving stones from one place to the next. The second guy said, I'm building a wall. But the third guy had a really interesting response. He said, what I'm doing is I'm building a cathedral. And of course, that's the same sort of supernatural perspective we're all called to take when it comes to evaluating, if you will, the value of our work. And the whole point is to not be scandalized by the ordinary character of our work, but to realize that when we do these things in accordance with God's will, these things gain infinite value. And in reality, we're actually participating in bringing about the salvation of the world. Okay, but that brings us to our third and final point. And the point is basically this. We should actively resist the temptation to run away from our ordinary lives, but instead realize that God's providence typically works within the context of the simple and the humble and the ordinary. And so the example that comes to mind to kind of illustrate the point in this regard is the example of parents. And so I can't tell you how often as a priest I've had conversations with parents who openly lament the fact that they can't be more active in the church in more kind of overt sort of ways, right? Participating in clubs and parish events and whatnot. And what they say is that, I don't have time, Father, because I'm too busy attending to my duties as a mother or a father or my kind of secular job on top of that. And even though there might be issues of time management and whatnot, what I tend to tell parents in those particular situations is you're probably doing precisely what you're supposed to do. You're attending to the duty of the moment and you're attending to your duty as parents, raising these kids as saints and future disciples of the Lord. And to kind of emphasize the point, think about the figure of St. Joseph the worker himself. And so based on what we know of St. Joseph from the Gospels, like, well, what do we know, right? We know that he was a carpenter. We know that he had a really intense interior life fueled by a regular habit of prayer. We know that he really wanted to do God's will. And we know that he was really protective of his family, protective of his wife, protective of his son, focused entirely on raising the child Jesus as his own. And so from the perspective of the world, what does St. Joseph accomplish? Not that much. I mean, even from his own perspective, you got to appreciate that St. Joseph never actually was privy to Jesus' public ministry. He never saw Jesus teach or preach or do any sort of miracles. And yet, what's the reality? The reality is that in the words of Father James Martin, this guy changed the life of the one who would ultimately change the world. And isn't that the great act of faith on the part of many parents out there? So what do? You focus on caring for your kids, loving your kids, being faithful to the will of the Father in terms of your ordinary duties as Christian mothers and fathers. And again, for the most part, it might seem like you're not doing all that much. But the reality is quite different. The reality is that no matter who you are or what your particular circumstances might be, if you are acting in accordance with God's particular will for your life, that thing that you're doing, even though it might be couched very much in the simple and the humble, the ordinary, gains infinite value. That thing gains infinite value in the eyes of the Lord. And it has the effect of actually bringing about the work of salvation. Live your life like that. Do your work like that. Attend to do the moments like that with that supernatural mindset, and see that your small, ordinary efforts don't renew the face of the earth. And may God bless you all.